Hi, I'm Whitney Belker with Miami's Global Connection. Our show is designed to raise public awareness of the interdependent world in which we live. We focus on local leaders who are involved in diverse international issues and projects. The sponsor of our show is the Greater Miami chapter of the United Nations Association, otherwise known as the UNA. The UNA is a grassroots organization devoted to informing and educating the public about the critical services provided by the United Nations. It is the nation's largest nonpartisan foreign policy organization with a network of 26,000 members. Today, our guest is Mr. Jorge Arrisurieta, Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer of FTAA Florida, where his main mission is to secure that Miami, Florida, become the site of the permanent Secretariat of the Free Trade Area of the Americas. Mr. Arrisurieta previously served as the U.S. Alternate Executive Director to the Inter-American Development Bank, as well as the Inter-American Investment Corporation. Prior to his time in Washington, Mr. Arrisurieta was the Vice President of Public Affairs for Huizinga Holdings and AutoNation, the largest automotive retailer in the world. Mr. Arrisurieta, thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks for the opportunity to join this show.
Well, first of all, let's start with, what is the Free Trade Area of the Americas?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, we've all heard lots about the acronym FTAA. It's important to sort of note that when completed, and we hope this will happen by January of 2005, the Free Trade Area of the Americas will be the largest free trade agreement in the history of the world. What does that mean? That means that the 34 nations of the Western Hemisphere, the 34 democratically elected nations of the Western Hemisphere, will unite behind this wonderful, large, awesome free trade initiative that will be twice the size of the European Union and will encompass 800 million consumers. And the reason why it's 800 million consumers is if you get the sum total of the populations of the 34 nations, you have 800 million people.
It's a very large trading bloc.
It would be.
Yeah, and so ultimately that means, for example, a company based in Alaska, if I'm not mistaken, will ultimately, when the tariffs go down to perhaps a zero tariff, would be able to export a product to, say, Argentina. Whereas now those tariffs might be in a range of, say, 17 to up to 27%. Is that correct?
Well, it's important to note that a free trade agreement is obviously a process by which countries, whether it's bilaterally, meaning two nations or more, or multilaterally, which is how you have in the case of the European Union, the countries of Europe, and obviously in the case of the FTAA, the countries of Latin America, you have nations coming together to try to work out an agreement, hence the term agreement, whereby these tariffs are not fully removed, because it would be probably unfair to make that category, that generalizations. But the reason why, one of the many reasons why this is a process that takes years to finalize an agreement, is because you've got to find a way whereby all nations, and in the case of this agreement, it's a very complex reality, because you've got 34 nations, you've got small economies, you've got mid-sized economies, you've got large economies, you have countries with political challenges of one sort, and you've got countries with all kinds of other opportunities of one sort, and you've got to try to bring them all together.
It's a massive negotiation process.
And again, you've got countries with populations as small as 35,000 in the case of some of the Caribbean nations, and countries as large as ours and Brazil and others in excess of 200 million people. So it's a very, very complex process, but what you're trying to do is figure out a way whereby not only multinationals, but small and medium-sized entrepreneurs can get a chance to export their products and at the same time import opportunities for other small and mid-sized companies.
Recently it seems as though we're seeing more negative press related to the FTA than really exposing some of the opportunities. And you mentioned some of the opportunities that exist for smaller companies. In today's day and age, it's generally the larger companies, for example, in the United States, that are able to export into Latin America. Whereas the FTA could create more opportunities for small businesses. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, there's lots of generalizations from this process, and one of them is that only multinationals, who, as we all know, already have access to the world marketplace are the ones who are going to benefit from these agreements. And I believe it's totally untrue. It's important to note, that's why I mentioned it, that the small and mid-sized entrepreneur, small and mid-sized companies will have a chance if they do a few things. Keep in mind that when you're talking about exporting your product across the world, part of what we'll have to do, though, have to be some kind of reinvention of who you are, because you're going to have to find these international, you have to comply with these international standards that are part of how you can export your product. But the opportunity clearly will be way beyond just multinationals who already have access to the world marketplace. It'll be for small and medium entrepreneurs as well.
Right. If I'm not mistaken, this has become more of a negotiation, not about what you can get, but more perhaps on behalf of the United States, what the U.S. might have to give up. I know that the agricultural subsidies is a hot issue in terms of trying to make something work with the smaller economies.
No, I mean, I think the agricultural issue, which is one of the many issues that's within this agreement that is being negotiated, and by the way, so is the Permanent Secretariat. It's part of that massive agreement. You've got agriculture issues, you've got intellectual property, you've got a number of issues, and included in that number of issues is the Permanent Secretariat. The one that's getting the most press in a somewhat negative way is probably agriculture. And I think it's important to highlight and most of the nations, and not all of them, who are part of this agreement have industries that are trying to figure out a way to protect or at least to phase out the removal of some of these protections in some kind of a prudent period, depending on how each country defines that. I think it's important to note that everybody is for fair trade, everybody is for free trade, I'm sorry, and some will say, well, it's got to be obviously free, but it also has to be fair. And I think everybody defines fair differently, and I think it's important to highlight that, because I'm not sure it's just the U.S. and I'm not sure it's just Brazil that's trying to protect some of its industries. And in the case of Florida, in the case of the U.S., obviously, there's lots of effort to try to figure out a way to
surely, it's the smaller economies are clearly trying to protect their smaller industries that are going to have significant challenges as this come to fruition. But let's talk about what your current role is with Florida FTAA. I understand you've been hired to help secure Miami as the permanent secretariat seat. What is this all about?
Well, this is really a unique opportunity that this state has, this community, specifically South Florida, specifically Miami, has a great opportunity to really land this most coveted prize. This most coveted prize is really no different than New Yorkers probably felt 50 years ago when they were working on trying to land the United Nations to be located in New York City as it is. It really allowed New York City to reaffirm its brand of being truly an international city. We in Florida, we in Miami are the gateway of the Americas. Landing this most coveted prize in our community will ensure and will ratify this brand that we have called ourselves for more than 4 decades. Not landing it probably will allow that some of this trade that we have, Florida is the largest trading partner with all the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, it'll probably continue. But I think there'll be an opportunity cost if we don't succeed in this effort.
Well, let's talk about the reasons why you feel that Miami is the natural seat for the permanent secretariat.
Well, we really believe that we're the ideal location, we're the natural location, we're to a certain degree the neutral option, and we'll talk about that as well. But here in Florida, you heard me say that we're the largest trading partner. Most of that flows through in and out of Miami, not just Miami. It's important to note that all of our airports and seaports complement the status that Miami has in a very large way. Miami is truly a microcosm of all the countries in Latin America and Caribbean. There isn't a single city in the entire world, nonetheless, with the Western Hemisphere, not even any of the cities that are competing with us in this effort, that has the representation that we have of all 33 nations, like we have in South Florida and Miami and the entire state of Florida. That doesn't guarantee us anything, but it's an important factor to be able to reach out to our friends in Latin America and remind them of these ties that have already united us for the past 4 decades. We believe also that we have not only the cultural sensitivities, but the multilingual professional staff that you need to have to be able to support a beacon of free trade like this institution will be located right here in our own community.
As I understand it, Miami's come up with 12 reasons why the city feels that it is the natural location, including the ports. I understand Miami is the largest cargo port for trading with Latin America, the cultural aspect, the trade infrastructure.